Good morning. It's good to see everyone here today. Glad to have you out. Looking forward to a good day today. Want to wish all of our fathers happy Father's Day. We are thankful that you have chosen to come and to be here with us today. We'll have more stuff out on the table at the back at the end of the service, but we've got I think it was labeled Rad Dad's Buffet. And so there's all kinds of stuff out there related to pops or dads. And so stop by and grab you a couple things on your way out the door this morning. And we want you to know that we appreciate you and are thankful for you. Thank you, Travis. Thank you, sir. All right, well, let's stand together. This morning we're going to begin with the word of prayer. So let's begin this morning. Gary, I'm going to ask if you would open us in prayer, please.
forsake me, I'll never be alone. All I ever need is Jesus. All I want to sing is His name. All my heart belongs to Jesus. By His grace and mercy, I'm saved. There are no riches that could persuade me or steal away my soul. I have been ransomed now and forever, my Savior, my reward. All I ever need is Jesus. All I want to sing is His name. All my heart belongs to Jesus. By His grace and mercy, I'm saved. You're my future, you're my hope. You're the anchor for my soul. And I was made for you. All I ever need is Jesus. All I want to sing is His name. All my heart belongs to Jesus. By His grace and mercy, I'm saved. All my heart belongs to Jesus. By His grace and mercy, I'm saved.
Genesis chapter number 11. We're going to begin in verse 31 this morning. Genesis chapter 11, verse 31. Begins, it says, And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son, Abram's wife. And they went forth with them from the Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran and dwelt there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Chapter 12, Now the Lord had said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old, and when he departed, when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. Father, we come before you this morning. We thank you for the opportunity to sing praises to your name. We thank you for the song that Deidre sang and the grace and the mercy of Christ. And I pray that our lives would be a testimony of that song, that you are all we need, and that we would trust in you, that we would depend upon you, that we would follow you and allow you to guide us and not lean on our own understanding. I pray now that you bless the reading of your word and just help us to give attention to your word for the next few moments as we look at the life of Abraham and look at a few things here. I just pray that you would be with me, give me clarity of thought, of mind, and of speech, and I pray that you would speak to our hearts today and do what only you can do. In your name I pray, amen and amen. Well, our intention and endeavor this day, of course, is to speak to our fathers, to challenge them, to encourage them. But again, just like with Mother's Day, not just the fathers only, but I believe that in the text that we have in front of us and the subject that we're going to deal with today, just like on Mother's Day, that it is something that is helpful for each and every one of us. I read a story in a publication from several years ago, and it said that it was according to the story, it was a Sunday morning, and a father was there at his house, sitting in his lazy chair, his easy chair, reading the Sunday newspaper, and his son came in and said, "Hey, Daddy, put down the paper and let's get ready for church." And he said, "Daddy, aren't you going with me?" And the dad said, "No, I'm not going, but I want you to hurry up and get ready so you can go." And so the little boy did. He said he went every Sunday, and he reminded his father of that. And then as the little boy walked away, the story goes on to say that because the father had made the statement, I went every Sunday as a little boy. And as that little boy walked away, he said, "Well, I bet it won't do me any good either." There's another story told of a man that sat down at a restaurant, and as he sat down at the restaurant, the waiter asked, what will you have? And so the guy responded and responded with what he wanted was an alcoholic beverage. And the waiter then turned to the little boy and asked what he would have. And the little boy said, "I'll have the same as my dad." And the dad said, "In that case, give me something different." The truth is that we need to be reminded that our children, our young people, are watching us. They're paying attention. And many times when we think if you've been paying attention, you find out that they've been paying attention even when it looked like they weren't paying attention. And you may hear them say something and you're like, "Oh, that sounds like me," or "That sounds like their mother or their father," whatever the case is. And the fact is, this is not just another Sunday, but it is a day while we celebrate the resurrection of our Lord, and we're thankful for what he has done for us. It is because of that we also have the opportunity to be reminded of the awesome responsibility that is ours as parents, yes, but as fathers as well. As those that young people look up to, whether it be the children in our house or even new believers, there are those that are looking up to us and watching us. The fact is that many believe that a good father is one who teaches their children about all of these things that we see on the platform, and how to be an athlete and to work out and to be healthy or to play sports, whatever the sport of choice is, or whether it's to be a handyman. I can tell you this, my father taught me and invested in me in some of these things, but he did not invest in me in some of these things, and my handiwork shows that he did not invest in me in these things. After I left the house and grew up and moved off to Bible college, my dad started doing a remodel of the house, and come to find out, my dad was a very good handyman and a very good woodsman. He could do a lot of things, and he went to town on this stuff. But I would come home from college, and I'm like, "Oh, I didn't know you could do this, and I won't be passing this on to anybody because I have no idea. The fact is, very often we think that these are the most important things to pass along and to teach our children. And the fact is, none of these things are bad necessarily. There's any number of things that they can do with these things, and we can teach our children these things and equip them at least with some of these things for at least a part of their lives. But the fact of the matter is, none of these things or anything else that we want to put up here as a representation of what we teach our children are the most important thing that a father or a mother or an authority figure, someone who has influence in the life of a young person, can teach them or give them. I'm thankful for those that invest in their children and make these things a part of their life and help them. They can be used to teach a work ethic and to teach integrity and all of those things. But understand this, that the most important thing that we can teach, the most important thing that we can give to our young people is our faith. To teach them about living by faith. Now, the fact is, on Mother's Day, we looked at Jochebed, a mother of faith. And so I felt it only fitting this morning that we look at Abraham, a father of faith. And so today, Lord willing, we're going to look at a part of the life of Abraham and see the example of faith that he set. Someone once made the statement, if other planets are inhabited, they must be using the earth for their insane asylum. Sometimes that's kind of what it feels like, isn't it? And I understand there's humor in that statement, but the sad reality is that our world is a mess, and it's not going to get any better. But hold on, it's nothing new. It's not like suddenly after, the year 2000, how many of you remember the big panic going from 1999 to 2000? When the clock strikes midnight, the world is just basically going to implode. Yeah, I remember those days. But so it's nothing new. That it's not like something happened when the clock struck midnight on December 31st, 1999, and we launched into 2000. The fact of the matter is, things have been a mess for a long time. We can look back here at the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and they record in Genesis chapter 1 through 11, here's what we find recorded. Failure after failure after failure after failure that honestly, to a great extent, are still being repeated even today. In chapter 3, we have the first man and the woman of creation that disobeyed God, and they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. In chapter 4, we have Cain, who murdered his brother Abel and then lied about it. In chapter 6, 7, and 8, we find there that mankind became so corrupt and so vile that God set Noah and his family apart and then wiped the entire earth out with the worldwide flood. Chapter 9, Noah gets drunk and immorality ensues. In chapter 10, in defiance of God, mankind began to build a city and a tower in an effort to reach the heavens. And so God sent confusion to end the rebellion, and then thus through that scattered them from there. And so we find even in these first 11 chapters of the Bible that there was disobedience and murder, deception and drunkenness and immorality and rebellion running rampant. Sounds like we just turned the news on, doesn't it? In 2024. It's no different. Here was a group of people that at one time knew the true God, but they came to a place where they refused to glorify Him as God, and they wouldn't give Him thanks for the provision that He had made, and they began to substitute idols for the true and the living God, and then the idolatry led to immorality and indecency, and before long we reached this point where we see God just gave them over. Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, we see the progression. In verse 24, it says he gave them up to uncleanness. A couple of verses later, in verse 26, it says he gave them up to vile affections. In verse 28, he gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. It's been a progression since sin entered into the world. Here we come to this man, Abram, eventually to be known as Abraham, and God called him out and set him apart to begin using him and to make of him a great nation. And so in the life of Abraham, we see an example, let's be honest, not only for fathers, obviously for fathers it is a good example, but the truth is it's an example for all believers who desire to walk by faith. And hold on just a second. It ought to be a desire for all believers to walk by faith. Sadly, many are quite satisfactory. They're quite complacent with just the fact that they say, well, I've trusted Christ, I'm forgiven of my sin, and so now I'm going to go on and live my life as I choose. But the fact of the matter is, He called us to live by faith. And so we see, as we did it on Mother's Day, we saw the faith of Jochebed. And today we look at the life of Abraham. And our desire ought to be that we would exemplify a life of faith, that we would exemplify before our children, that we would exemplify before our grandchildren, that we would exemplify before those that are watching us that have gone before, that we would set an example for those that are to follow of living by faith. Living by faith. In Genesis chapter 12, we see here in verses 1 through 3 how Abraham began to live by faith. Now, remember this. Here's the thing. Abraham did not grow up serving and honoring Jehovah God. When God called Abraham out, he left the gods of his father and he began to follow after Jehovah God. He went to his father and he said, listen, I have come to an understanding that where we have been and what we have been doing and those we have been serving and worshiping are not the true God. This Jehovah God is the true God. And Abraham stepped out, listen, honestly, completely by faith in a path that he had never been in before, in a place that he had never seen before, in something that was completely new to him and foreign to what he had grown up with under the care of his father. And he began to follow and to live by faith. And so God speaks to Abraham and he calls him to separate from all the corruption that was around him and the gods of his father. And so Abraham and Sarah are called upon to leave their home and to go to a new land. God calls Abraham to leave, not knowing where he was going. Abraham had no idea where he was going. God simply said, to a land that I will show thee. I'm going to take you to a place that you don't know of, and I'm going to show you, but not yet. And so he went out not knowing ultimately where he was going to be going. In Hebrews, it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was called out to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith, he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And listen, the fact of the matter is, so often in our lives, maybe we say we're going to live by faith, but then when God calls us to do something, we say, hold up, we need to have a meeting. I need all the details first. I need the agenda of where we're going first. I don't know about you, but when I travel, and I'm sure I've shared this before, there's probably very little in 15 years that I haven't shared or said before, but for those of you that have heard it before, please just bear with me in my being senile and not remembering what all I've said. When we travel, I like to know where I'm going. Like, number one, I'm not getting in a car and just setting out across country without having an end goal in mind. Because I don't want to end up in California, unless it's on purpose. I may not be getting off of the road I'm on and taking an exit to get onto an adjacent highway or whatever the case is for 75, 100 miles. But I want to know what it is that I'm looking for. Now, hold on. In all transparency, my wife is my navigator, and she's going to tell me because I ask, where are we going? She's going to tell me. And in about 30 miles, I'm going to say, now, what exit was that again? And she's going to tell me. And then in about 20 miles, I'm going to ask again. And then as we get closer, I'm going to confirm to make sure that I know where I'm going. I want the details. That's one thing I love about the GPS map. You can pull that up. You can put it in, and provided it's taking you to the right place, which it doesn't always, you can look at the steps, and you can see I'm going to go this far for this long, and then I'm going to go this far for this long, and then I'm going to go this far for this long, and then we're going this way, this way, this way, whatever the case is. But understand this, that's not how it works with God. That may be how it works for us as we're traveling. And I believe there's some wisdom in that. But when it comes to living by faith and trusting God, it is not, all right, hold up, God. I need the agenda. I need step by step. I need to know what's going to happen down at this point in the road and at this point in the road. I need to know where we're going, and I need to know where we're going to end up. It's not how that works. It's not how it worked with Abraham. The fact is, Abraham said, God told Abraham, I'm going to show you, but not yet. So just pack up and go. Sarah said, where are we going? I don't know. Now, let's be honest, probably not many spouses or family members are just going to get in the car if they ask, hey, where are we going? And the response is, I don't know. Now, sometimes we'll get in the car. My daughter's looking at me. We'll get in the car and they'll say, where are we going? And I'll say, well, you'll find out when we get there. Now, the truth is, I know where I'm going. Sometimes I want to try and surprise them, or I want to occupy their minds with them trying to figure it out. Sometimes that doesn't work in my advantage because they ask 4.2 million questions. But if somebody says, hey, get in the car, we're going for a ride. Well, where are we going? I don't know. Well, how long are we going to be gone? I have no idea. Well, when are we going to get there? I don't know. We'll get there when we get there. Now, for some people, when you get to retirement, that might be how it works. You pack the camper and you go. Terry and Margaret used to say, all right, Pastor, we're going to be gone for a few weeks. Well, where are you going? Well, we're going south till it's not cold anymore. Well, how long are you going to be there? Until the freezer's full. Then we'll come back home. And they'd come home with a mess of crappie. But listen, that's not how it works with God. Here's what we find. Now, we find a lot of people that question God when he gave them instructions and commands. But when God called Abraham, here's what we find. Abraham simply obeyed. He did, what God called him to do. He simply took God at his word and he relied upon him. Imagine if we as believers today would commit to that kind of faith. To just follow God. Hold on, not lean on our own understanding. How many Christians claim, quote, recite, read, reference, live by that verse, but don't really live by that verse? Because mostly what we do is we lean on our own understanding. But imagine if we would commit to the kind of faith that Abraham had when God said, go and I will show you, and he just went. I mean, he left the country that he knew, he left the land of his family, he left the house of his father, and he set out for the unknown. All because God said, go. And he went, despite any questions that Sarah may have had. he did exactly what God called him to do. And the fact of the matter is, Sarah was faithful in that she obeyed. She didn't hold him back. She didn't drag her heels in. She dig her heels in. She didn't keep him from going. She went. That's not to say she may not have been nervous. Sure. Listen, nobody's saying there's no nervousness involved in faith. Because when we live by faith, there is an element of the unknown. It's kind of nervous, isn't it? Hey, listen, when we get into situations, when we're stepping into something that is unknown, it's nervousness. How many of you have ever been invited to somebody's house for dinner and you were nervous about what they were going to fix? I have. Pierre and Jill invited us over for lunch one Sunday afternoon, and we had planned it a couple weeks out, and I'm not going to lie. I knew I wasn't going to show up and have hamburgers or hot dogs or steak or, grilled chicken. They told us we're going to fix a traditional Lebanese meal. I was nervous. Was I going to show up, with like a hog on a stick over the table and an open fire? I didn't know. I've never been to Lebanon. I don't know what they're going to serve. I was nervous. I went in. Thankfully, there was plenty of food. And there was plenty that I could eat. And there was probably, I understand I'm a little more finicky than some people. I have a bit more of a refined palate than most. I was really nervous. I was. Hey, listen, there is an element of that to faith because it is the unknown. But the fact is, God has called us to live by faith. Imagine that. Your spouse comes home, your husband comes home and says, hey, pack up, we're leaving. I don't know where we're going. I don't know how long it's going to take. God just said we're going to start traveling. And let's be honest, Abraham and Sarah weren't getting in a car with air conditioning and multiple sources of media to occupy their time. We're just going to go until he says stop. I remember when back in 1998, Deidre and I moved to Florida. And when we went, we had no place to live when we got there. No prospects. We had to get down there. We had to find a place to live. We knew God wanted us in Florida. We just didn't know where he was going to let us live. And so for several weeks, we lived in a room in the pastor's house, and then we house sat another individual's house in the church while they were gone, while we were looking for a house in Florida. And finally, we found one, and my wife was a trooper through all of that, and it was weird, and I'm not saying it's an experience I want to live over. Did we learn something in that? Sure. Am I signing up to go live in other people's houses for a while? Not necessarily, unless God says, hey. But Abraham was given a task, and he obeyed. Think about Moses. When Moses was given a task, what did Moses do? Let's be honest, he debated with God, didn't he? I kind of feel, I kind of envision that when God called Moses to do something, that in that moment, Moses dealing with God, or God dealing with Moses, was kind of like us as grown adults dealing with our children and all the excuses they want to put out as to why they can't do this and they can't do that and they can't keep their room clean and they can't quite get their clothes in the laundry basket, or they can't do their laundry, or why they can't brush their teeth, or they can't shower, or they can't put their dish in the dishwasher. Those are all things I've read about other parents dealing with. And it's, as God was talking with Moses, it's as though Moses' line was, but. How many of you ever dealt with a child that had a but for everything? Yeah. But with Abraham, that's not the response we see. Abraham doesn't come back with, I'm too old, or I'm too busy, or I need some direction, I need an agenda. Well, hold up, God, my wife doesn't like this. Or how long is this going to take? Which is every kid's question when you get in the car. If you're not going to the grocery store or to the church or to this place or to that place, if you're going for any length of time, doesn't matter how many times you've made that drive, well, how long is this going to take? We're going to go to Owasso today. Well, how long is this going to take? Well, I need to know where we're going before we head out. That wasn't the response of Abraham. God told him here in these first 3 verses of chapter 12, he says, get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, in verse 1, from thy father's house into a land that I'm going to show thee. I'll make of thee a great nation. He does give him some details. He tells him some things that are going to happen, but he doesn't say when or how long it's going to be or where this is going to take place. But he says, I'll make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee. I'll make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. I'll bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. That was what he got. And in verse 4, hold up, let's be honest. Looking at verses 1 through 3, that's probably not what we would consider enough information for us to set out on a life-changing journey. Let's just be fair and call it what it is. I mean, there's some great things that he says in there, but probably not quite enough for us to say, oh, okay, and go. But look at verse 4. So Abraham, what? There's one of you. Hold on. All I'm asking you is tell me what the verse says. I'm not saying that when church is over, I'm going to expect you to go do the same. In the respect that Abraham did. All right? So, not a trick question, I promise. So, verse 4, so Abraham what? See, that wasn't hard. Good job, class. As the Lord had spoken unto him. Here's what we find is that Abraham's obedience was evidence of his faith. His obedience was evidence of his faith. He could have stood there all day long and said, Lord, I have faith. Lord, I believe in you. Lord, I trust in you. I'm just not going to do this. Well, it'd be kind of hard to see his faith if he wasn't willing to do what God had called him to do. But as verse 4 says, Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken unto him. And so we see his obedience was evidence of his faith. Here's what we find. Eventually, Abraham comes to be known as the friend of God. Why is that? Because Abraham obeyed. Abraham obeyed. Listen, here's what we find. We can look at the passage here in chapter 11 and 12, and then we can jump to Hebrews chapter 11. And in Hebrews chapter 11, here's what we find this phrase, by faith, Abraham, anybody want to take a guess? Obeyed. By faith, Abraham obeyed. Hebrews chapter 11 is known as the hall of what? Faith. Those that are listed there, they lived out a great faith. And even many that aren't listed, and it says, for time would fail us to mention. And then it mentions some by name, and then there's many that it does not mention. But we find there that those that are in Hebrews chapter 11 are there because they lived by faith, which means they obeyed even when they didn't understand everything that God was asking them to do. By faith, Abraham obeyed. He didn't just obey and go, but get this, he stayed. He stayed. Oftentimes when someone moves to a new area, it's difficult adjusting to that new area, especially a different area of the world. The Pliskas are in Japan, and they're in that process of adapting and adjusting to the culture of Japan as they endeavor to reach the Japanese people with the gospel of Christ as God has called them to do. But they're there, and they're in that difficult process and transition time of adjusting. And oftentimes, you get to those places, there's so many different things that you have to deal with when God calls you to a new place. And sometimes people don't stay in obedience to what God has called them to do. Because they don't like the culture, or they don't like the climate, or they don't like the customs, or they don't like the dialect, whatever the case is. That many times, if they're not willing to be obedient, they'll find any reason that they can. And I'm not saying that everybody that goes to the mission field and comes back is being disobedient, because oftentimes God will take them there for a season and then bring them back to their place of origin for whatever reasons. But then there are times we have to acknowledge some people won't stay because they're running from God. They're not willing to be obedient. And here, Abraham and Sarah, they obeyed and they stayed. I mean, everything that they're encountering is new for them. Everything. Abraham obeyed when he didn't know the where. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 12, it speaks to that, where it talks about Abraham lived by faith and obeyed by faith. But he didn't know the where when he went. He didn't know the how. Hebrews 11 and 12 speak to. There, of course, had been this promise of a great seed, but to this point, there was no seed. Now, Abraham and Sarah are in their old age, and in this old age, many years, at least 25 years after the time that the promise had been given, the Sarah conceives and soon gives birth to Isaac, just as God had promised. But he didn't, when the promise was made, when they left, he didn't know the where, he didn't know the how. To be honest, he didn't really know the why. It speaks about in verses 17 through 19 of Hebrews chapter 11. There we find the trial of Abraham as God commanded him to take his son, the promised seed, the one who would make Abraham a father of many nations, and yet he followed through with what was going to be the sacrifice of the son of the promise. But even in that, Abraham obeyed. And in the face of great trials, in the place of not understanding, he obeyed every step of the way, even to taking his son up upon the mountain to offer him as a sacrifice, because he had enough faith to know that God would provide a sacrifice or God would raise Isaac from the dead. He was willing to obey, and he had the faith to obey. Now, none of this means that Abraham and Sarah were perfect by any means, because they weren't. They weren't perfect, but they were following. The truth is they failed and they messed up along their journey. Now, there's a part of us that would have to say, thank goodness. Because let's be honest, we've all messed up and failed in our journey. Many, many, many times. Sometimes to the point that we feel like there's no way God could use me. There's nothing that God could do with me. Look at all the things that I've done. Well, the truth is we can point to lots of people and we can find lots of failures, and yet God still used them in great and mighty ways. Let's not limit what God can do with us. Let's just allow God to do what God can and wants to do. But the truth is, Abraham and Sarah, they failed and they messed up along their journey. But their life and their walk was typically characterized by faith, by faithfulness, and by obedience. Hey, listen, the fact is we are going to continue to mess up. We're going to continue to fail. We're going to continue to make mistakes. Why is that? Because we are sinful creatures and we're living in the flesh. We have not yet achieved perfection. We have not yet received our glorified bodies. But the fact is that even though we mess up, and even though we fail, and even though we trip up, the fact is we can still live by faith, and we can still be faithful, and we can still be obedient. Like Abraham and Sarah. Their life is a life that we should endeavor to live. You know, the fact is, Isaac wasn't there to see Abraham step out in faith and leave his home and head to a place that he didn't know about. But he heard about it. The stories were told about what mom and dad did, where mom and dad were, what they were called to do, and how they stepped out and did that. Isaac wasn't there to see how Abraham and Sarah handled the promise of a great seed, yet having no seed. But Isaac was there in the later years to see Abraham and Sarah being faithful and being obedient when God commanded them to take the next step. Isaac saw as Abraham was faithful in taking that next step when God commanded Abraham to take Isaac to the mountain. Isaac heard his father say, God will provide himself a lamb. He watched as Abraham went so far as to bind him and to place him on the altar and to raise the knife above his head. The fact is, Abraham was setting an example of faith, of faithfulness, and obedience for Isaac to follow. It shouldn't be any different for us in our lives in 2024. We ought to endeavor, we ought to pursue to live a life of faith. We ought to endeavor and we ought to pursue to live a life of faithfulness. We ought to endeavor, we ought to pursue to live a life of obedience to God, our Heavenly Father, who sent His Son to die on the cross for us. Many people will say, well, I want to experience the life and the blessings that Abraham and Sarah experienced. But yet they're not willing to live the life that Abraham and Sarah lived. Well, I want the blessings and all the things that they came to know. Well, are you willing to live the life of faith that Abraham and Sarah lived? Are you willing to live the life of faithfulness that Abraham and Sarah lived? Are you willing to live the life of obedience that Abraham and Sarah lived? It's not a freebie in this respect. Salvation, yes, salvation. Christ paid the penalty for our debt and for our sin. But the fact of the matter is, there are those blessings and there are those things that we can experience in this life like Abraham and Sarah did, but it requires us to live a life of faith. It requires us to live a life of faithfulness. It requires us to live a life of obedience because that's what God has called us to do. To live a life of faith, faithfulness, and obedience. The fact is, how they responded to God determined what God did in their lives. Now, hold on just a second. Sometimes as adults we can look at that and say, well, I don't like that. How many of you have ever looked at a child? You don't have to raise your hand because I know the answer. But how many of you ever looked at a child and said, well, your behavior and your attitude is going to determine what happens next. Your behavior and your attitude is going to determine what you get to experience and what you get to enjoy. You know, we've got these things planned, but the famous parent line, I can change that real quick. We can change the plans because their behavior and their attitude doesn't allow for that. The fact of the matter is, if we want those to experience those things like our forefathers did, if we want to experience the life and the blessings and some of the things that they did, well, guess what? We need to live a life of faith, faithfulness, and obedience. We can't just go out there and live life any way that we want and do whatever we want and shirk our responsibility to God and ignore the Word of God and ignore the life and the path that He has called us to and just go do whatever we want and expect to be to experience and enjoy all the things that those who followed God experienced and enjoyed. How they responded to God determined what God did in their lives. How you respond to God will determine what God will do in your life. Now, thankfully, we didn't have to be good to gain salvation. Thankfully, we have Romans 5:8, where God commendeth or gave His love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He did that for us, and it is because of that that we should live a life of faith, faithfulness, and obedience. If you live a life of faith, faithfulness, and obedience, God can and will do much in your life. He can do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, if we'll let Him. Sometimes we don't see the things in our life because we disallow it because of our lack of faith and our lack of faithfulness and lack of obedience. God didn't give Abraham reasons or explanations for anything he did in his life. He just simply gave Abraham promises. He said, I will show thee, I will make of thee, I will bless thee, I will bless them that bless thee. He gave us promises, and He gives us promises, but we have to be faith. We have to live a life of faith, be faithful and obedient as we follow Him. Go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, and look at verse 33. Who through what? Faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. All of these things that we just read in verses 33, 34, and 35 were accomplished because of or by one thing: faith. They lived by faith. Understand this morning, through faith, we can lead our families for the glory of God. We can lead our children, we can lead our grandchildren, we can lead those around us by faith. We can raise our children for the glory of God. And listen, even in this world, even in this society, with all the things that are inundating them, we can raise them to be godly. We can teach them to be godly. Is it wrong to teach them how to play basketball? Absolutely not. Football, baseball, soccer, golf, work out, lift weights, how to do all the handy stuff. Hey, listen, perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable. But the greater thing is that we teach them to live by faith. Be an example to others. Honestly, whether it's our children or new believers, we need to be an example to them. We need to disciple our children and new believers. We need to disciple them in the things of God. Albert Einstein said, setting an example is not the main means of influencing another. It is the only means. Setting an example. How many of you ever heard, do as I say, not as I do? How's that work out? Not so well. Not so well. There's a lot of things in this life. There's a lot of things. Maybe there's a lot of people you've dealt with. There's a lot of people I deal with. They say, don't do this, this, and this, and this. But then I have to go deal with that person because they've done the very thing they've told other people not to do. I have to encourage them, strengthen them, help them find the help they need because they did all of these things that they were telling other people, hey, don't do these things. And then they went out and did them themselves. They'll tell these over here, you do this, you're going to destroy your life, you're going to mess this up, it's going to have lasting repercussions. And then they come over and they do the same thing. Do as I say, not as I do doesn't work very well. It ought to be, do as I say, as I do. Because what I tell you I'm going to do, I'm going to exemplify it, I'm going to live it out before you. Be an example. It's not always easy, but it can be done. When nobody else was living right, when no one else was doing right, no one else was living for God, Noah still did. He built an ark. 120 years he worked on this ark, being mocked and ridiculed. But he still lived and did. He had faith, and he was faithful, and he was obedient. When no one else was doing right and living for God, even though Moses had his mistakes and he did things, there were those times when no one else was doing right and living for God. Moses did. He stood up to Pharaoh in the palace where he was raised, and he honored God because he had faith and he was faithful and obedient. Now, the truth is that at times it can seem like no one else is raising their children for the glory of God. Nobody else is fighting the battles that I'm fighting. They are. Most of us just don't come out and talk about them. But we're all fighting the battles. We're all fighting with society. We're all fighting the ills of this world to raise our children and our young people, hopefully in a life of faith. So just have faith, dads. Just have faith, moms, grandparents, and remain faithful. It may seem like nobody else is discipling others and teaching them the ways of God, but you can remain faithful and obedient. Think about this. Where would Isaac have been if Abraham and Sarah had not committed themselves to obey the Lord by faith? Where would Isaac have been? Where would Israel have been if Abraham and Sarah had not committed themselves to obey the Lord by faith? God said, I'm going to make of you a great nation. And the truth is, it is through that, as we've seen in the book of Romans, it is through the nation of Israel that God promised that He would bless all the other nations. So where would Israel be if Abraham and Sarah hadn't obeyed? Where would we be if Abraham and Sarah had not obeyed the Lord by faith? Where would we be if previous generations of Christians had not been obedient and given themselves fully to the Lord? There are those of us that look back at the generations before us, but we must not take for granted what they taught us. Find those things that they taught us that are in accordance to the Word of God, and stick with those things and follow those things and live a life of faith and being faithful and being obedient to the Lord. That's what He's called us to do. Abraham set an example. We as fathers, as believers, need to set an example for those who will come after us. Our desire ought to be that those that come behind us find us to be faithful. Find us to be faithful. Parents that wish to train their children in the way that they should go, guess what? They ought to go in the way that they would have their children go. Exemplify a life of faith. Exemplify a life of faithfulness. Exemplify a life of obedience. Be an example. J. Edgar Hoover said, if I had a son, I'd do one thing. I'd tell the truth. I'd never let him catch me in a lie. In return, I'd insist that he tell the truth. When children go astray, it isn't the fault of the children, but of their parents. I think there's some leeway in that, in understanding. But in the context of which he is speaking, he goes on to say a spoiled boy grows into a spoiled man. So I'd try to be a pal to my boy. I'd have my son go to church. What's more, I'd go with him. Set an example. Be the parent. Be the dad. Well, sometimes that means that we have to enforce the rules and we have to discipline, and sometimes we're going to be the mean guy. At other times that means that we can be the corny guy with the great jokes, and we can embarrass them. I have some great jokes. Just ask me after church. I'll share some with you. My kids don't agree, but if I get an eye roll or a groan out of them, cha-ching, I have accomplished my purpose. We can have fun with them, and we can be goofy, and we can be silly, and we can do all of those things, but we still have to be dad. We still have to be mom. We still have to be the parent. One individual said, when it comes to my children, my ultimate goal for them is heaven, not Harvard. If they go to the ladder on their way to heaven, that's great. But if I reverse the equation, I failed them. Listen, we can teach our children and our young people about all of these things. We can teach them how to keep their eye on the ball, regardless of the sport. We can teach them to focus on those things and to keep their eye on the ball as it's coming into home plate and they're ready to swing, or as they're guiding the ball into their glove, or whether it's soccer and kick with the ball into the net, or the golf ball down the fairway, the basketball into the hoop, or the football into the end zone. Whatever the case is, we can teach our children to keep their eye on the ball, but if we don't teach them to keep their eye on Christ, we have failed. They can kick a ball, shoot a ball, throw a ball, hit the golf ball, lift the weights, do the woodworking, whatever the case is. They can do all of those things, but if they cannot keep and do not keep their eye on Christ, if they do not live a life of faith, if they do not live a life of faithfulness, if they do not live a life of obedience, as parents, we have failed. Now, sometimes we can exemplify that before them, and they still choose to go off and to do their own thing. As long as you have done your part, that does not lie on you. But if you have failed to teach them to live a life of faith, a life of faithfulness, and a life of obedience, then there is going to be some blame on your part. Because that's what God has called us to do as parents, as authorities, is to exemplify a life of faith, faithfulness, and obedience. So be an example. Let's stand with every head bowed, every eye closed this morning. Father, we come before you this morning. We thank you for your word. We thank you for the accounts that you have given us that we can look to, that we can receive instruction from. And as we have seen that you gave Abraham a command and he departed and did what you called him to do. This morning we're not calling anyone here to pack up their belongings and to set out on a journey across the country or the world. But we are asking them, Lord, to go home and to live a life of faith, faithfulness, and obedience.